Poland invokes the NATO treaty's consultation provisions after the alliance scrambles fighter jets to shoot down a Russian drone incursion into its airspace. Is this a test of the West by Vladimir Putin, or maybe a warning? Meantime, Donald Trump says he's almost ready, but not quite, to impose new sanctions on Russian energy.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board members Kate Batchelder-Odell and Jillian Melcher, calling in from a reporting trip to eastern Ukraine. Poland has now called on Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance, requiring allies to consult when one of them is facing a threat to its territorial integrity. That comes after at least 19 Russian drones flew into Polish airspace last week. The NATO forces responding to that incursion included Polish F-16 fighter jets, Dutch F-35s, German Patriot air defenses, and more, according to NATO Secretary General. Some of the drones downed apparently are cheap dummy drones, unarmed, sometimes made of wood and foam. Jillian, what's your read of what Vladimir Putin is up to?
Yes, I think he's trying two things here. One of them is to test NATO and see what their response is. And I think the other one is this is obviously a pretty serious event that just happened. And I think that NATO countries are rightly concerned. But right now, Ukraine really needs Western air defense to help protect its skies. And Putin may be hoping that the West feels like it needs to save those air defense resources for itself. So this may be a way of preparing the battlefield for the winter, making it easier for Russia to attack Ukraine and leave Ukraine less able to defend itself against missiles.
Kate, President Trump suggested last week that this might have been a mistake, as if these drones meant to take a right and accidentally took a left and meandered themselves into Polish airspace. A couple things. One is that if you look at the map of where they were reportedly droned, they are pretty far, some of them, into Poland. And two, also reports of incursions into Romanian airspace. Maybe Trump is just trying to leave room for negotiations. But what's your read of the Putin approach here?
I think the bottom line is that Putin is escalating, and the direction of travel right now is going the wrong way, away from a settlement that favors the United States. To your point, the sheer number of drones that wandered into Poland belies that it was merely a mistake. To that point, I would also add that some of these recovered drones were found to have fuel tanks attached to them that allowed them to travel, as much as 900 kilometers. So this was an intentional act. I think the president knows that, despite his saying it was a mistake. I also give Poland credit for reiterating that it was not a mistake amid the president's remarks. And also NATO understands it wasn't a mistake because NATO has deployed more defensive assets to shore up NATO's eastern front and defend against these kinds of provocations. But my larger concern here is that Putin has not paid a price for escalating in this fashion. And the president is kind of continuing his politics of personal diplomacy and has not yet been willing to get out his toolbox of sanctions and weapons and show Putin that it's unacceptable to fly Russian drones into Poland, which is home, by the way, to a rotating 10,000 U.S. troops. This is a pretty direct provocation to NATO, and it's so far not being treated as such.
Jillian, you have a report on the Journal's pages today under the headline, Russia's alarming drone incursion into Poland. One of the things that you talk about, and we've discussed this before, is this asymmetry problem. If drone warfare is getting cheaper and adversaries are getting pretty good at pumping out these cheap drones, it's an issue if the way that the West starts taking them down is by shooting extremely expensive missiles at them, scrambling extremely expensive fighter jets. What's your thoughts on how NATO is thinking about that problem?
Well, not hard enough would be my easy answer. It's been really interesting talking to European officials and then talking to folks here on the ground in Ukraine. So Europe feels like it handled this okay. It did a pretty good job. It was able to scramble air defense resources and shoot down some of these drones over Poland. But when I'm talking to Ukrainians, they are saying a couple of things. That number one, this is a massive failure of deterrence. And that when Vladimir Putin senses weakness, he takes advantage of it. And they're looking at things like the number of drones that Russia's producing, now about 2,700 Shahed-type attack drones a month, a ton of decoy drones like the ones that we've seen in Poland. And the goal of these is to overwhelm air defenses. And they're, by the way, really cheap to make. So the decoy drones, about $10,000. Shaheds run $50,000 to $100,000 roughly. And we're talking about shooting them down with things that are scarce and that cost $1 million or more. And Ukrainians are saying this is a really dangerous situation. Your deterrence is failing. And if Vladimir Putin were to attack Europe in the same way that he is attacking Ukraine with these combined strikes that involve several days in a row, several hundred drones combined with missiles, it stresses air defense. The goal is to overwhelm it. And the question is, does Europe have enough on hand in its stockpile to defend itself? And I think there's a real concern that it doesn't.
This is a problem, by the way, not only in Eastern Europe. Similar sort of conversations have been had about the Houthi attacks. Sometimes there's drones that are coming out of that hotspot. Kate, I mean, the Pentagon is not unaware of this problem. What are some of the ways that they are thinking about approaching it? And maybe they've made some progress and are just choosing at this moment not to show their hand.
Well, I think you're right that there is an awareness of the problem and a lot of tech interests and capital flowing into trying to solve it. There are a mix of ways to get after it, including cheaper projectiles, more electronic warfare abilities, jamming, for instance, and also more electronic jamming and other technologies. So I don't think it's hopeless, and I think that the West is certainly waking up to it. What concerns me even more than our military capability, though, which I do think has started to attract some important minds and attention, is that here we see a larger failure of political will, which is what Jillian's calling that failure of deterrence. I mean, we have here Putin thinks it's an acceptable risk that he can take to fly 19 drones into Poland, and that he won't pay a serious price for it, that he might get from President Trump another 2-week deadline, which he can buy off and perhaps express some more interest. I think that is a larger story and danger here that's not fully appreciated. And again, the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. You've seen, again, as I talk about the escalations that Putin is making. Another one is that the Kremlin is deploying a lot of rhetoric similar sounding to how they talk about Ukraine to countries like Finland, and starting to build these larger cases for other lost provinces in greater Russia. And so the stakes here really are much higher than Ukraine's borders.
Jillian, it seems like President Trump keeps hoping and hoping and hoping that Vladimir Putin will prove to be a good faith negotiator on this question of some kind of settlement to his war, his invasion. And to my mind, Putin keeps sending signals that he is not interested in that. I mean, the drone incursion into Poland is an obvious one, but a couple more in the last couple of weeks. One is his suggestion that if Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, wants to meet, Putin would be happy to welcome him to Russia. I mean, to my mind, that is pretty much a non-starter, in part because Russia has tried repeatedly throughout the war to assassinate Zelensky. And so the idea that he is going to be welcomed to the Kremlin to sit down for tea, I don't think is on anyone's realistic radar. Two is some of the jamming, electronic jamming that you've reported on that is happening in Europe. Recently, a plane carrying a top EU official was landing in an EU member state and a NATO member state and was jammed electronically. And NATO and EU officials are suggesting that they think this was intentional interference, blatant interference from Russia. Jillian, talk about a little bit about that problem that is pretty widespread now and has gotten worse since the Ukraine invasion.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's disturbing. I think what you see is a constant trend of escalation, and people tend to refer to it as hybrid warfare or hybrid aggression. But with what we saw with Poland, flying drones into a NATO country, that is not hybrid warfare anymore. That's a violation of their airspace. But with this jamming, yeah, it's really ticked up. So planes have other ways to navigate, but you don't ever want a pilot having the risk of getting disoriented. And the scale of this was really shocking to me when I started to dig into it. I had, somebody who tracks this telling me it's been more or less constant. In Estonia, I was hearing that there have been times where every plane flying within a certain range has had some sort of GPS interference. And it's not just electronic warfare targeting aviation. This is also happening in the context of malign activities in the Baltic Sea. You've seen several suspicious incidents where important electricity or energy cables have been cut by ships in an area where we know a lot of Russia's shadow fleet is sailing. Reports of assassination attempts against targeting a European defense official. Several incidents in Europe that look a lot like sabotage. So I think what we're seeing here is a pretty steady stream of Russian escalation that stretches far beyond Ukraine, and a very weak European and NATO response to that. And everybody in Ukraine that I'm talking to is saying, you are inviting more trouble if you don't respond to this forcefully.
Kate, to the point about another 2 weeks, there's this sanctions bill that is sitting there in the Senate, has bipartisan support, has supermajority support, and to my eye, the Senate is just waiting for President Trump to say, now is the time to move it. Let's listen to one of the sponsors, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, making the argument recently.
No, it is time for Europe to get behind President Trump to punish Putin's customers. Putin has been sanctioned, literally his economy has been sanctioned every way it can be sanctioned. President Trump approach is to go after China and India. President Trump put a 25% tariff on every Indian product coming into America because they buy cheap Russian oil. He is now going after China. He posted yesterday to our European allies, mostly NATO allies, that he expects them to follow his lead by imposing tariffs on China for 50 to 100%, up to 100% on products coming into Europe. It is now time for Europe to get behind the Trump approach. The Europeans say they love the Graham bill. Graham-Blumenthal bill is 85 co-sponsors in the Senate that will allow President Trump to tariff people who buy cheap Russian oil and for their benefit, like China, India, Brazil. It is now time for the Europeans to follow President Trump's lead and go after China and India. China and India will change their practices toward Putin. This war would end.
Here's a social media post from President Trump saying he's ready to do major sanctions on Russia when all NATO nations have agreed and started to do the same thing, and when all NATO nations stop buying oil from Russia, unquote. Kate, is there a way to read that other than another 2 weeks, another delaying tactic, trying to get all NATO nations on board, some of them who have more favorable views of Russian energy imports than President Trump does? And at what point does the Senate say, we have 85 co-sponsors of this bill and we are going to pass it?
Well, let me start by saying I think Trump is correct that European countries should stop purchasing Russian oil. I've appreciated the renewed European seriousness about defending itself against an increasingly provocative Russia. And you have folks out there like NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte saying strong things like, my job is to make sure we're not all taking Russian language classes. So there's this percolating understanding that there's a real threat at Europe's front door. And that does have to be matched with some real changes in energy policy. So on that discrete point, Trump is correct. And particularly a country like Hungary, his friend Viktor Orban, who is buying Russian oil, there's pressure he can apply to get some of these countries to stop doing that. At the same time, It's hard to know whether this is a real attempt to persuade Europe or a prelude to another 2-week deadline. To your point about the bill in Congress, it has more than 80 co-sponsors in a group in the Senate, in a group of 100 people who can barely agree to fund the government. Just a rare outbreak of bipartisan agreement. And it has languished for months as Republicans say, let's give Trump some running room to do his personal diplomacy routine and try to get somewhere with Putin. And maybe you could understand some of that initially, but it's now been 8 months with no result. And I think Congress at some point has to assert itself as a co-equal branch of government that has a role in defending U.S. interests and setting security policy. And so, Republicans, for instance, during the Biden administration, really took political risk with their own base to shore up President Biden by voting for weapons support for Ukraine and for passing bills that there was percolating unhappiness with on the right because Biden was losing in Ukraine. He didn't have a strategy and stuff. And that support from Republicans in the Senate and House and passing those bills and saying, no, the United States still has a role to play in the world. We're going to hold the line against Putin here so we don't have to deal with him later on the Polish border. That had a real effect. And I think that was a real demonstration of will that mattered. And so what I'm getting at here is that Congress can help the president by passing this sanctions bill now. And even though Trump might prefer to keep all of his options open, he needs more leverage. And whether he is aware of that or ready to accept it, Congress has a stake here, and I think has an opportunity to play another productive role in tradition with some of that earlier action on Ukraine.
Well, we're talking about ways that the West can raise the cost to Putin of continuing this war. One of them might be sanctions. Another might be continuing shipments of U.S. arms, Patriot missiles, and so forth that the Ukrainians are using to defend themselves. But Jillian, also an interesting story recently about efforts to support Ukraine's own domestic defense suppliers. A Ukrainian defense firm setting up shop in Denmark to make rocket propellants for a new long-range missile developed in Ukraine. What's the story there?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Ukraine has been working on developing a long-range missile. It's called the Flamingo because of its hot pink tip. And it can go reportedly more than 1,800 miles. It's got a 2,500-pound warhead. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Ukraine needs to strike into Russia. It's not a Western weapon. And start taking out some of those drone manufacturing plants, command and control centers, and logistics. So Europe has been starting to think about how they can support Ukraine's domestic weapons industry. One way of doing that is like what you saw with the Danish announcement, where they're saying, come to Denmark. You can set up some of your operations here and we'll effectively act as a sanctuary for you to do production outside of Russia's strike reach. That's really important because some of these weapons are pretty energy intensive at a time when Russia has been conducting strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Not everything can be done underground. So that's one way of supporting them. But Ukraine is building a lot of stuff in Ukrainian borders. Europe is doing some stuff to help fund that. But keep in mind that Russia has about $300 billion of reserves that are parked in the West. And if you really wanted to do something to get Putin's attention, a good idea would be to confiscate them and turn that money over to Ukraine to ramp up weapons production.
Kate, a couple of thoughts here on the weapons point. I mean, we've talked about the restrictions that first the Biden administration and now apparently the Trump administration has put on the use of Western supplied missiles, deterring Ukraine from using those to strike any suppliers or targets in Russian territory. I mean, that does put them at a disadvantage if Ukraine and its own suppliers and weapons factories are under threat of bombardment at all times. So this effort to attract some of those companies to set up shop in Denmark and other places might be a way of leveling that balance. And at the same time, if some of these Ukrainian companies, particularly the drone companies and drone defense companies, have built some expertise on this new kind of warfare, maybe there's something that NATO allies can learn from having those facilities and operations in a place where they can take a look at the way those Ukrainian companies are handling that problem. Two is to the extent that Ukraine is developing its own missiles like this Flamingo that have the same long-range capability and can allow it to strike Russian targets on Russian territory without those U.S. restrictions. I mean, maybe that would raise the cost and be something that Putin would need to think about, though I can't imagine that the supplies of those weapons is going to reach, at least currently, at least quickly, the U.S. supplied weapons. And so that's not an argument for the U.S. to continue its restrictions on those Ukrainian targetings.
Yeah, I mean, to your first point, I mean, Trump said himself that only a few weeks ago that Ukraine was in trouble because Biden wouldn't let them win the war. They were only allowed to defend themselves and not to strike back. And that is true. And we've, Vietnam is the core example people use of why you can't allow someone a sanctuary to recoup and expect to prevail in a conflict. So I do think there is an ongoing debate, especially in the administration, about what restrictions to put on weapons. And for instance, some cheaper, longer range stuff that we've given Ukraine, what restrictions will they be able to use those to strike into Russia? That is a crucial debate right now because they need to get more leverage. I think we've established on this podcast, in our pages, everywhere else, that currently Putin is not behaving as he wants to come to the table. And so that we're going to have to change the battlefield a little bit to make him think that he's got to come to the table. And to your second point about Ukraine, the Army Secretary called Ukraine the Silicon Valley of warfare. And there are real opportunities for the United States to try to work more closely with Ukraine and learn more of these lessons that may be vital someday to U.S. forces. I mean, another analyst I follow said the other day, I think a good point to remember, that Ukraine is in some sense fighting every axis of that axis of adversaries forming against the United States. I mean, there are North Korean troops in Ukraine, Iranian drones in heavy use in Ukraine, China purchasing Russian oil and underwriting its war economy. And so this is something that the U.S. will have to confront at some point. And so working with Ukraine to learn more about how to fight against these drones and how to integrate better counter drone things is absolutely essential. And I think the United States is starting to do some of that, but it is a reminder that our support for them is not charity, and it's something that we need to do to shore up our own ability to defend ourselves. But again, I think Trump's point about Ukraine not being able to win the war does underscore his ideological flexibility, if you will, in this negotiation, that it is still possible for him to pivot on Putin and change his strategy and start to get him closer to the table through that sanctions bill, through better weapons deliveries, fewer restrictions. I mean, that policy cocktail, it's still available to him. And I think hopefully the voices will continue to make that case to him inside his own administration.
Thank you, Kate and Jillian. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.